Today's track is like rolling thunder, and it comes at you just like a hurricane. It's powerful, it is heavy hitting, it's an anthem, and it's designed to blow you away. But in spite of all that, it was actually written as a tribute to a fallen frontman, one who has gone down in the pages of rock history as one of the very best. His replacement, though, he's been pretty iconic himself, charged with writing the lyrics to this rock epitaph on a tight deadline, just one day. He found himself paralyzed with writer's block, but after some unexpected inspiration and spooky supernatural experience, his fortunes began to improve from there. Find out what it was like for the new guy coming into a band that was at the forefront of rock and roll to try and take them to that next level. It's coming up next on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you chose a side in the VHS versus Betamax argument back in the day, if you even know what that is, you're going to dig this channel of pure nostalgia. Make sure that you subscribe below right now. Click the big red button. Also, click that bell so that you get our latest and greatest. We also have a Patreon. You're going to want to check that out where we're putting up full-length interviews there. Check it out today. So I'm excited today to get into the story behind the opening track of the biggest selling rock and roll album in history, acdc's Take No Prisoners, Spare No Lives tribute to the late great Bon Scott, Hell's Bells. Just weeks into the recording of acdc's landmark album Back in Black, newly hired lead singer Brian Johnson was suffering from writer's block. It was the spring of 1980, and the band had gathered at Compass Point Studios in the Bahamas. The Young brothers, Malcom and Angus, they were furiously churning out new material for the record at breakneck speeds. I mean, just as Brian finished the lyrics to one song, the brothers were right there with another riff ready to go. Finally, one morning, Brian Johnson hit the wall. Or as he described it, he was dead in the head. In his newly released memoirs, Johnson recounted what happened next. I'll just paraphrase what he said there. Got to pick that up. It's a great book. Outside, there were black clouds that were forming on the horizon, and soon a storm was raging over the ocean. About this time, there was a knock on the door of Johnson's guest house, and when he opened it, he saw legendary producer Mutt Lange, a certifiable musical genius if there was one. Lange had produced acdc's previous album, Highway to Hell, and was on the island with them to helm the sequel. The second that Brian Johnson opened the door, Mutt saw the look on his face. And he said, "What's the matter, Brian?" "I'm struggling here, Mutt. I've just got a bit of writer's block. That's all." As Mutt stood there in the open doorway, he thought for a moment and he asked, "Are you stuck on anything in particular?" Brian said he was working on a new riff from Malcom. It was called Hell's Bells. Just then, somewhere in the distance, there was a loud, earth-shaking roar. "That's rolling thunder," said Lange. It was an expression that Brian Johnson hadn't heard before, but instantly something within him clicked, and Mutt could see it in Brian's eyes. "There you go," he said, "your first line." After that, it started dumping rain. Pouring rain is what Brian said. "And listen to that wind," said Mutt. "It's coming on like a hurricane," is what Brian said. And boom, that was it. acdc's newly anointed lyrics off and running. Okay, maybe the conversation didn't go exactly like that, is what Brian Johnson said, but it was pretty close to that. The opening lines of Hell's Bells practically wrote themselves on the spot, paving the way for what would be one of the most unforgettable opening tracks to one of the biggest albums of the rock era. Actually, the biggest selling rock and roll album, if you're saying just pure rock and roll. Because, you know, Thriller's not a rock album. I'm, of course, talking about Back in Black. And it was all about Bon Scott, acdc's first lead singing legend. According to Angus, the Back in Black's all-black cover was a sign of mourning for Bon. But the band also wanted it to be a celebration of Scott. Originally, Atlantic Records resisted the concept of a black cover, but they eventually acquiesced when the band agreed to have their logo outlined in gray. It was February 19th, 1980, when tragedy struck. Bon Scott was discovered dead in the back of a friend's car in London after a heavy night of partying. The official cause of Scott's death was, of course, classified as alcohol poisoning and death by misadventure. Now, past installments, we've taken a close look at the events surrounding Bon's death, so I won't go into great detail here. But you can get the rest of the story if you check out our episodes on You Shook Me All Night Long and also Back in Black. Now, it goes without saying, but the loss of Bon Scott was absolutely devastating, and acdc seriously contemplated breaking up. However, Bon's close friends and family, particularly Bon's father, encouraged the band to find a new lead singer and just keep going. After a lot of deliberation, the guys decided to actively pursue a new lead singer after Bon's funeral. acdc ultimately hired ex-Geordie frontman Brian Johnson, and they made the official announcement on April 1st, 1980. Brian Johnson proved to be the perfect addition for this ascending band. Now, Back in Black was released on July 25th of 1980. Great way to start out the 80s. There's no doubt this is one of the most important albums ever released in the rock era. acdc, of course, was already on the rise with their previous record, Highway to Hell, before Back in Black had been their best seller. But Back in Black would overtake it by a long shot on its way to selling an estimated 50 million copies worldwide. Like I said, the biggest selling rock album worldwide. The Brian Johnson debut peaked at number 4 on the Billboard album charts, and it remained there for the next year and a half. The first single from Back in Black was the incomparable rocker, You Shook Me All Night Long. Other singles would include Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution, Back in Black, of course, the title track, and today's featured song, Hell's Bells. Again, such a great book here, but Johnson points out in his biography that there have been some controversy surrounding the authorship of some of the songs on Back in Black. This is another topic we've examined in previous episodes. Today I want to give Brian Johnson the last word, the final word on all of this. This is what he said in his recent biography. Now, as we go into this section, I do want to thank our sponsors, Zenni Eyewear, the glasses I always jam. As we're starting off the new year, it is the perfect time to enhance your look, your style, your eyewear with a brand new pair of glasses from Zenni. You can actually get 2 or 3 pair for less than the price of a vinyl record. Check it out at our link below or download the Zenni app. Now, what Brian Johnson said is the conspiracy theories are legion, usually started by people who think that they know what happened, but weren't there. That includes one journalist in Australia who claimed that Bon Scott had already scribbled most of the words to this album in one of his notebooks before he died. But no, it was me at the end of the pen, writing every night and every morning with only the title to work with. End of quote. Brian explained that his daily writing process culminated when they met up with Mutt Lange in the studio each morning. This was around 11 a.m. I guess every band member had an appointed time to be there to record their parts. So Brian would give him what he had written, and as I noted earlier, things were moving really fast. There was a lot of pressure on Brian Johnson coming into this band. But he said that at the same time, it was also very, very exciting. Anyway, after Johnson turned in his day's homework, Mutt would photocopy the lyrics and give a copy to an engineer named Tony Platt. And then Brian would record his vocals, and Mutt would take some notes, and that was pretty much it. Brian would say that every line, every word on Back in Black was written with an overnight deadline. There was no time to second guess anything. Like the album itself, Hell's Bells was written to be a tribute to Bon Scott. Brian Johnson credited the brothers Young for coming up with the idea, though. He said, that was definitely Mal and Ang. They wanted something symbolic, for whom the bell tolls or whatever. Malcom Young said, we were talking about the Hell's Bells intro, and it was a really good intro. It was really ominous. Angus had the title Hell's Bells. When asked about the remainder of the writing process, Brian Johnson insinuated that it was something of a supernatural experience. After that initial lightning strike of inspiration with Mutt Lange that we talked about earlier, Brian would later sit down and hash out the rest of this song. Explaining what came next, Brian said, "Now, I don't believe in God or heaven or hell, but something happened. We have these little rooms, like cells with a bed and a toilet, no TVs. I had this big sheet of paper and I had to write some words. I was going, oh, frick." And I'll never forget, I just went. I started writing and I never stopped. And that was it. Hell's bells, I had a bottle of whiskey and I kept the light on all night, man. Those were his words. Also, in a documentary for VH1, Brian Johnson said during the writing of the record that he was paralyzed with fear. Praying for guidance, he revealed that he experienced a supernatural event regarding Bon Scott that he was reluctant to go into detail about. He did later admit that one night he was woken up out of a dead sleep and was inspired to sit and write lyrics down as fast as he could put them down on paper. Sounds like a supernatural experience involving Bon Scott there. Amazing. Also, talking about praying for guidance is a little bit of a contradiction there, since he said he didn't believe in God or heaven or hell. But maybe he changed his mind, I don't know. The track opens with the infamous tolling of a church bell, which may be reminiscent of a funeral, but also served to signal that something massive was on the horizon. The bell rings out 4 times before that guitar riff hits. And then there are 9 more chimes before it fades out on lucky number 13. After that main riff kicks in, the song begins to build very slowly with Phil's bass drum and cymbals. And then it starts picking up speed. By the time Brian Johnson launches into the vocals, about a minute and a half in, full on rocking. Angus and Malcom were set on recording an actual church bell for the track. They wanted to sound as authentic as possible. So Tony Platt was set on a mission back to find the perfect bell in the UK. Tony chose the Denison bell in the Carillion Tower at the Loughborough War Museum. Platt then rented a mobile recording unit, and armed with 24 mics, he attempted to get tolling it on tape. However, there were birds living in the bell tower. Every single time it rang, those birds would fly around in a ruckus, and they'd chirp and make a lot of noise, and it made the recording completely unusable. Ultimately, Tony had to abandon that idea, but luckily they had a plan B. That plan B, acdc had confirmed the type of bell sound that they wanted. They commissioned a replica of the 4-ton Denison bell to actually take out on tour with them. But that would actually be too heavy, so the guys would settle for 3 tons lighter. The John Taylor & Co. Foundry was chosen for the job. When finished, the 1-ton monster would include the acdc logo and the words Hell's Bell stamped on its side. So since the real Denison bell was a no-go, acdc had the work sped up on their copy. Fortunately, it was finished just in time to meet the album's recording deadline. The Hell's Bell was then hung on a block and tackle, and the man who cast it had the honor of striking it for the track. That'd be cool to be known as the guy that struck the bell for the track. The only problem was that since it was so much smaller than the Denison bell, its tone just wasn't right. So Platt brought the recordings to New York's Electric Lady Studios. There he and producer Mutt Lange figured out the right combination of sounds. For the mix, they slowed the tape down to half speed, and it turned out to be just the foreboding sound that they were looking for. So just a funny side note, Brian said that he found out later that while the Hell's Bell was still in the foundry, the workers actually hung it from the ceiling and tapped it with their forklift when it was time for a meal break. That makes it quite possibly the world's most expensive dinner gong. I thought that was a nice touch. Hell's Bell would, of course, become one of the most iconic stage props in rock and roll history. Right up there with a lot of the stuff that Pink Floyd has done. AC/DC lugged that massive bronze bell all across the world. Tough break for the roadies. Brian Johnson was the one who had the privilege of ringing it night in and night out with what he called a Thor-like metal sledgehammer. In time, it would be replaced with a fiberglass copy, for concerts. It goes without saying, but that one was considerably lighter than the original. Now, lyrically, Hell's Bells isn't for the faint of heart. The song not only invokes hell, obviously, but also includes references to the Lord of the Inferno himself, with lines like, "I'll give you black sensations up and down your spine, and if you're into evil, you're a friend of mine." Let's just say that that was enough to put it in the crosshairs during the satanic panic of the 80s. Made it a target of the PMRC, and it's also in a book that was required reading while I was growing up that had a chapter in it about how hard rock and heavy metal music was corrupting our children and causing them to commit suicide and to kill. I always heard it as a big, bad hard rock song. That's pretty much, I didn't read into it much. Hell's Bells never charted on the Billboard Hot 100, though. Did at least reach number 50 on the mainstream rock chart. Surprisingly, it also didn't chart in Australia. Now, it did reach number 61 in Switzerland and number 25 in Germany. That was about it. It was well under the radar around the world, at least for that time, which is kind of weird because You Shook Me All Night Long and Back in Black, they both broke into the top 40 on the Hot 100. The first one to number 35 and the next one 37. And it also came from the biggest selling rock album of all time, like I've said. But despite Hell's Bells' lackluster reception on the charts, it's absolutely one of AC/DC's greatest songs, off arguably their best album. And, further proof that while Brian Johnson had some mighty big shoes to fill, he was making his own mark as the new singer of this band, with his gasoline and Nell's hardcore vocal gymnastics. He kept the band just breathing fire. Now, in terms of pop culture, Hell's Bells, it's appeared in a few movies and TV shows over the years. Actually, far too few. I was a little bit surprised. The list includes Maximum Overdrive.
This could be a very long day.
Monster Jam, Welcome to the 80s, and Supernatural. Supernatural always has great music.
Whoops.
However, one thing that Hell's Bells has been used for quite a bit is to fire up fans and players at pro sporting events. In fact, it was one of the first songs to be regularly played as entrance music for a Major League Baseball relief pitcher. Started in the 90s, Hell's Bells became the official anthem for San Diego Padres reliever Trevor Hoffman whenever he took the mound, one of the greatest relief pitchers in history. Hell's Bells is also, not surprisingly, part of the NHL's New Jersey Devils in-arena playlist. Can also be heard in the NFL at Raiders games. Hell's Bells has also been covered by a number of artists. Dandy Warhols, Buckethead, LA Guns, Slaughter did it, Fish, and Kirk Hammett from Metallica. And of course, there was also that time when AC/DC temporarily featured Axl Rose as a guest vocalist, filling in for Brian Johnson, who was having some hearing problems at the time. Looking back on the process of writing and recording the first album with AC/DC, Brian Johnson remembers being incredibly relieved when it was all done. Years later, he could still recall that moment vividly. He said, it was about 3 p.m. It was a beautiful sunny day, and I went outside down to where the huts were. I sat on this wall. and I got a ciggy out and I sat among the trees. I was so happy that I had done it. End of quote. Well, what he had done was nearly the impossible. I mean, Brian Johnson had come aboard to take that lead mic in a band that was skyrocketing on incredibly short notice. Over the course of just a handful of weeks, he had managed to keep up with this prolific bandmates as they fired off new material left and right, writing lyrics at the drop of a hat, and ultimately putting the finishing touches on one of the biggest selling albums of all time and one of the greatest rock and roll albums ever. That day on the beach when he'd finished his contributions, Brian actually hadn't even heard any of the songs in their entirety. Mutt's process was to have him pop in and do a couple of verses and then come back later and do a chorus or whatever. He wouldn't hear what he had accomplished until he got his hands on a finished record, just like the rest of us. It was a first edition, of course. He said after pulling the record from his protective sleeve, he just held it in his hands, just staring at it. Felt like for hours. He was mesmerized by the cover. It was so simple, but so unbelievably cool. I love how he shares this in his book. It feels like we're there. Desperate to hear it, he actually had nothing to play it on. He was at his parents' place and all they had was a radio. So he called up his ex-Geordie bandmate guitarist Derek Rutham. He had a killer sound system, actually. On the other end of the phone, Derek said, "Oh, you're back, are you? What have you been doing all this time?" "Well, if I can come over and use your record player, you can hear for yourself." So a couple hours later, Brian Johnson was in his old bandmate's living room. And Back in Black placed it on the turntable. And as those opening bell chimes were coming on Hell's Bells, as they gave way to Malcolm's riff, Brian just sat there, just as shocked and in awe as the rest of us. All the while he was thinking, this sounds frickin' fantastic. And then he looked over at Derek, his buddy, and he noticed he was frowning and just shaking his head. When the song reached the "Won't Take No Prisoners" line, Derek gasped, "Oh, that's way too high." Brian was like, "What?" "Way too high. Come on, I'll take you out for a pint." And with that kick in the guts, the two friends went off to grab a pint. However, I'm sure millions upon millions of acdc faithful would disagree with Derek's assessment. I'm sure he came around. But as for Brian Johnson and the rest of us, we all knew from the moment that we heard Hell's Bells that it was just the beginning of something very, very special. I mean, rock and roll would never be the same again. This is one of those no-holds-barred, fire-spitting anthems of hard rock, if there ever was one. The opening shot of Brian Johnson's tenure with this legendary band and his mighty vocal swing. This still stings the uptight, and it still rings in our ears all these years later. Thanks so much for watching. Leave us a comment about acdc and Hell's Bells. What do you remember about this song? Let us know in the comments. What do you remember the first time you heard Back in Black? Or the first time you've shared it with somebody? If you like acdc's catalog, we got plenty to choose from in our catalog. Highway to Hell, Back in Black, all that good stuff. And make sure to subscribe if you like our videos so you don't miss out. We'd love to have you as part of our community. We're always talking music. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.